The salon erupted in laughter, sharp and brittle as broken glass, and Lady Eleanor Harwood felt the sting of every whisper as though it had been cast upon her very skin. She had barely crossed the threshold when a hush fell over the assembly, followed by that familiar, insidious murmur that she had long since come to dread. The Harwoods, so diminished, one lady murmured under her breath, and Eleanor, poor child, she must marry soon, or face disgrace. Eleanor's cheeks flamed, not with shame alone, but with the hollow knowledge that her family's fortune, once respectable and admired, now tottered on ruin. Every glance she met seemed to dissect her. Her fine gown of sapphire silk, intended to assert her dignity, now felt a fragile shield against the invisible knives of society. She clutched her fan with trembling fingers, its ivory surface cold and indifferent to her trembling heart. Her father, seated stiffly at the head of the room, maintained a studied calm, yet Eleanor sensed the tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. The weight of expectation pressed upon her with the force of a storm, for she knew why they had summoned her to this gathering. It was not celebration that brought her here, but arrangement, a binding of names, titles, and fortunes designed to mask the decay of their house. Eleanor had overheard fragments of conversation, whispers in the corridors. The Duke of Ashbourne, aloof, formidable, unyielding, yet recently widowed and in possession of a vast estate, would be her husband. A shiver ran down her spine, part anticipation, part dread. She had heard tales of him, of his cold reserve, of the fear he inspired in even the most daring of London society. He was a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured his steps across the polished floors of his ancestral home. To marry him was to step into a realm of icy propriety, where warmth and levity were strangers, and the smallest misstep could unravel one's entire standing. The room shifted then, imperceptibly at first, until all eyes turned to him. The Duke entered with the weight of inevitability, each measured step echoing across the parquet floor like the ticking of a relentless clock. His presence was formidable, tall and rigid, his dark eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. Conversation faltered, laughter died mid-phrase, and Eleanor felt her own breath catch at the sight of him. His expression betrayed nothing, no curiosity, no warmth, no hint of mercy, but in that absence of softness, Eleanor sensed an unspoken command. He expected obedience, composure, and decorum above all else. Her heart quivered, and she realized, with a sudden pang, that this marriage would not be a union of hearts, but a battlefield of restraint and expectation. And yet, she could not turn away. Perhaps it was curiosity, or the spark of defiance that had long lain dormant, but Eleanor met his gaze briefly, and in that fleeting contact, she caught a glimpse of something buried beneath the severity, loneliness. It was a faint trace, as delicate as smoke in sunlight, yet undeniable. She forced herself to step forward, bowing with precise elegance, her chin lifted just enough to hide the tremor in her throat. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. He inclined his head in return, the barest tilt, but enough to acknowledge her presence. "Lady Eleanor," he said, and his tone was smooth, measured, and unyielding, a voice that carried authority rather than warmth. "I trust London finds you well." The words were polite, yet each syllable was weighed with intent, as if he were testing her mettle even in the simplicity of introduction. Eleanor's pulse quickened. In that brief exchange, she understood the truth she had long avoided. She would not simply enter his house, she would need to navigate the labyrinth of his temperament, a maze of icy formality, hidden depths, and unspoken rules. The announcement came shortly thereafter, delivered with an almost ceremonial flourish by her father. The match was settled. Eleanor's stomach lurched. A hush fell over the room again, the kind that precluded laughter or objection. Faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, some judgmental, and some with the thinly veiled satisfaction of those who delight in the misfortune of others. She had entered the gathering as a hopeful, uncertain young woman. She departed as a bride-in-waiting, bound to a man whose affections were unknown, whose mind she could not read, and whose presence both intimidated and intrigued her. In the moments that followed, Eleanor wandered the edge of the salon, her hands pressed to the silk of her gown, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of chandeliers, portraits, and gilded mirrors that reflected a life she could scarcely call her own. She felt the weight of every expectation, every whispered admonition, every anticipatory glance. And yet, beneath the pressure, beneath the heat of humiliation and dread, something else began to stir, a small, almost imperceptible curiosity. Who was this Duke of Ashbourne, truly? What shadows lingered behind his carefully maintained exterior? She felt, somewhere deep in her chest, the first faint beat of a question she dared not speak aloud. Could a man so formidable, so precise, so seemingly untouchable, possess a heart capable of tenderness? The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation, measured smiles, and the faintest glimmers of hope. Eleanor noted the Duke's quiet observations, the way he did not condescend, nor did he flaunt superiority. He was exacting, yes, but not cruel, reserved, yet not unkind. There was a subtle tension in every interaction, a delicate balance between propriety and something unspoken, and Eleanor felt herself drawn into it despite every instinct that screamed caution. She caught herself imagining moments of ordinary life with him, walking through gardens at dawn, sharing whispered confidences beside a crackling hearth, scenarios that seemed impossibly intimate, yet tantalizingly plausible. And then, as the candles dimmed and the assembly began to disperse, Eleanor's father approached, placing a firm, possessive hand upon her shoulder. "Remember, child," he said softly, "your duty is to our name. You will speak little, bow when required, and learn the ways of the house. The Duke is exacting, but he is just. Remember your place, and you shall find safety within it." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, her mind spinning with both fear and a strange, irrepressible anticipation. As she turned to leave, she cast one last glance toward the Duke. He was standing apart from the crowd, shoulders squared, gaze directed outward, yet Eleanor imagined, just for an instant, that he had looked directly at her, that his eyes had flickered with some quiet recognition. She could not be certain. The moment passed as swiftly as it came, leaving her heart pounding and a question hanging in the air, delicate and terrifying in its simplicity. What manner of man would she truly be bound to, and what manner of love, if any, might awaken behind that frozen mask? The carriage wheels struck the cobblestones with a harsh rhythm, each jolt reverberating through Eleanor's bones as though the very earth conspired to remind her of the life she was leaving behind. Ashbourne Manor loomed on the horizon, a fortress of stone and shadow, its turrets clawing at the overcast sky. Eleanor's hands tightened around the edges of her gloves, knuckles paling, as a sense of foreboding pressed upon her chest. She had imagined grand halls, servants bowing at every corner, and a husband who would meet her with indifference, but the reality was more intimidating, more absolute than she had feared. Every detail, from the polished stone steps to the silent columns flanking the entrance, seemed designed to measure her resolve, to weigh her worth before she even crossed the threshold. She stepped from the carriage, her gown brushing the damp stones, and felt the eyes of the assembled household upon her, the butler, the footmen, the quiet glances of those who had long known the Duke and anticipated her arrival. Their faces betrayed nothing of opinion, yet Eleanor felt them pressing upon her like 1,000 unspoken judgments. She drew a breath, steadying herself against the tumult in her chest, and raised her chin. Every step forward was an act of courage, every movement a declaration of her survival. She could not flee now, she was the bride of Ashbourne, whether she wished it or not. The Duke awaited her in the grand hall, as immovable as the statues that lined the marble floors. He regarded her with that same measured gaze that had unsettled her at the London salon, silent, discerning, impervious to emotion. The first words between them were formalities, a curt acknowledgement of her safe arrival, the necessary etiquette of introduction and expectation. Yet even in their brevity, Eleanor caught a hint of something private, a trace of consideration beneath the stoic mask. He gestured toward a chair, and she lowered herself with precision, aware that every movement would be scrutinized, weighed, and catalogued. Days passed in a rigid cadence, each more exacting than the last. Breakfast in silence, the sound of silver against china echoing through the cavernous dining room, lessons in estate management, her mind grappling with ledgers and correspondence while he observed quietly, walks through gardens too vast to fully comprehend, their paths lined with the skeletal remains of autumn blooms. Eleanor learned quickly that Ashbourne demanded perfection, and yet in that demand, she discovered glimpses of humanity. A hand lightly resting on her elbow to guide her across uneven stone, a brief nod of approval when she executed a task correctly, gestures small, almost imperceptible, yet weighted with significance. It was during one such walk that she first received a token, a delicate sprig of rosemary, placed upon her desk with no explanation beyond the silent presence of the Duke across the room. Eleanor's fingers lingered upon the leaves, inhaling the subtle scent, and felt a warmth she had not anticipated. This was no grand declaration, no flourish of passion, it was the quiet insistence of attention, the understated proof of thoughtfulness, and it touched her more deeply than any public display of affection could have done. In that moment, she realized that this marriage, though born of obligation, might yet contain fragments of something genuine. Yet society was never far behind, and scandal brushed against her heels like a persistent shadow. A rumor spread among the distant cousins and visiting acquaintances, questioning her propriety, her intellect, even her suitability to remain within the austere walls of Ashbourne. Eleanor, ever graceful, bore the scrutiny with measured composure, yet the sting of each whispered insinuation cut more sharply than any overt insult could. She longed to retreat to the quiet of her chambers, to close the heavy drapes and forget the world outside, but the Duke's presence ensured she could not indulge weakness openly. He watched her with an intensity that made the air between them electric, as though he measured her endurance with every measured glance, every carefully neutral expression. One evening, as the last light of day slipped through tall windows, Eleanor discovered another small gift, a leather-bound journal, its pages blank, left upon her writing desk. A note accompanied it, written in the Duke's precise hand, "For thoughts you dare not speak aloud. Perhaps they will find a witness here." Her breath caught. This was not a command, nor a formality, it was an invitation, fragile and intimate, a bridge extended across the chasm of their restraint. Eleanor touched the paper, tracing the letters with a trembling fingertip, and felt a rush of emotions she had not anticipated: curiosity, fear, longing, and a fragile spark of hope. She began to write, carefully, cautiously, aware that the act itself was revolutionary. Each word was a confession, each line a thread woven toward understanding. And in the silence of the manor, she imagined the Duke reading them, absorbing them, recognizing her thoughts as something precious rather than trivial. There was a beauty in that thought, a tantalizing possibility that beneath his austere exterior lay a man capable of tenderness, attention, and perhaps, even affection. The tension between them deepened as days passed, marked by fleeting gestures and subtle tests of patience. He would allow her small liberties in conversation, a light jest, a question about a preference, a fleeting glance that lingered longer than decorum permitted. Eleanor, in turn, observed him with careful attention, the slight furrow of his brow when he concentrated, the rare curve of his mouth when amused, the hands folded with exacting precision that betrayed a life of discipline and restraint. Each moment was a delicate negotiation, a dance of curiosity, caution, and unspoken yearning. One evening, Eleanor overheard servants whispering about a distant cousin who had committed some minor social indiscretion, and she was reminded again of the world outside the manor, a world of judgment, expectation, and relentless scrutiny. Yet in the private corridors of Ashbourne, she felt the first taste of sanctuary, a place where small gestures, a hand lightly brushing hers in passing, a quietly offered cup of tea, a note tucked upon her desk, carried the weight of profound meaning. The Duke's attention was not loud, not performative, but deliberate, calculated, and infinitely significant. As the firelight flickered in her chambers, casting long shadows along the walls, Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest. She was learning the subtle rhythms of the Duke's attention, the quiet language of his care, and with it, a dangerous hope began to bloom within her. She understood, as clearly as the chill in the night air, that this was not a man easily moved, nor a heart lightly given, but that the possibility existed, delicate and fragile, that beneath the stoic surface, a depth of affection waited to be awakened. And yet, even in the midst of small comforts, Eleanor felt the weight of the unspoken, the vast expanse of unknown territory that stretched between them. Every gesture, every note, every whispered acknowledgement was a step along a precarious path. One misstep, one moment of misunderstanding, could return them both to isolation and coldness. She had discovered a flicker of warmth, yes, but the challenge remained: could she bridge the divide of years of solitude, pride, and unyielding duty to reach the man behind the mask? That night, she pressed her forehead to the journal's cover, inhaling its faint leather scent, and whispered to herself what she dared not speak aloud: "I will learn him. I will find the warmth he has hidden, and perhaps, if I am brave enough, he will find mine." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying a faint promise of storm, and Eleanor shivered, not with fear, but with anticipation. Somewhere in the vast halls of Ashbourne, he moved, silent, unseen, yet undeniably aware, and she sensed, as surely as the shadows clinging to the corners of the room, that their story had only just begun. Lightning split the sky above Ashbourne Manor, and the first roar of thunder rattled the tall windows with such ferocity that Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. She had been walking the empty corridors, restless, unable to settle in the quiet that normally comforted her, when the storm broke over the hills, wild and unrestrained. Rain lashed against the panes, a relentless percussion that mirrored the turmoil in her chest. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, fingers gripping the polished rail, and felt a shiver of fear and longing, fear for the unknown that lay ahead with the Duke, and longing for the humanity she had glimpsed in his fleeting gestures. The halls were vast, silent, and suffocating, yet she sensed she was not truly alone. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, almost imperceptible against the storm-darkened walls. "Lady Eleanor," came the Duke's voice, calm but layered with something unspoken, and she felt the air constrict around her. She turned slowly, and there he stood, his coat damp from the wind, hair slightly tousled, the intensity of his dark eyes reflecting the lightning beyond. In that instant, all the distance that decorum and routine had enforced seemed to evaporate, leaving only the raw truth of two people caught between fear and desire, between propriety and yearning. "I feared you might be caught in the rain," he said, his tone steady yet threaded with concern that neither of them had allowed to surface before. Eleanor's breath hitched. It was the first time she had heard anything resembling tenderness in his voice directed solely toward her. She tried to respond with formal civility, yet the words faltered, escaping as a whispered, I could not sleep. He took a measured step closer, yet not so near as to overwhelm. Nor could I, he admitted quietly, and in the simplicity of those words lay a confession heavier than any grand declaration. He spoke of his restless nights, the quiet echo of halls that had once held laughter but now only harbored memory and solitude. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She had suspected his loneliness, had sensed it in the careful manner of his attention, yet hearing it spoken aloud rendered it tangible, real, and achingly intimate. The storm raged outside, but within the corridor, a fragile stillness formed between them. She dared a question, trembling, "Do you ever regret it? This arrangement?" His eyes, dark and guarded, flickered with something almost imperceptible, regret, perhaps, or reflection. "I have spent my life bound by duty," he confessed, "by expectation. I know the world sees me as unyielding, as cold, but, in truth, I am not unfeeling. I have only forgotten how to be otherwise." Eleanor's lips parted, a breathless acknowledgment of the vulnerability she had longed to see. The Duke's hand, gloved but steady, hovered near hers as if daring to bridge the gap between caution and courage. She felt an almost magnetic pull, a silent invitation to trust, to step into intimacy that had until now been denied by society, by pride, by circumstance. Her heart raced. For the first time, she was not merely the bride navigating a rigid household, she was Eleanor, a woman capable of understanding, of care, of love. He gestured toward a small alcove at the end of the corridor, a hidden recess often used for private contemplation. "Come," he said softly. "Let us speak where the walls might bear witness to truths we cannot yet share with the world." She obeyed, and they settled in the alcove, the storm beyond the windows painting the walls with flashes of silver and shadow. In that intimate seclusion, words flowed differently, lighter, more tentative, yet weighted with emotion. Eleanor spoke of her fear, her uncertainty, the loneliness she had carried even in the midst of family. He listened, truly listened, with a patience that stilled the tumult in her chest. And then, when the world outside had grown distant and the rain's rhythm was a mere backdrop to their exchange, he revealed a fragment of himself, a piece of the man hidden beneath layers of discipline and expectation. He spoke of past grief, of loves lost, of the heavy mantle of leadership that had demanded sacrifice over desire. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve in a gesture of solidarity, of shared humanity. The contact, small and deliberate, sent a tremor through them both. "You are different from what I imagined," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. Eleanor caught her breath. "And you," she whispered, "are more tender than I could have known." They sat in silence for a heartbeat, the storm framing them, the walls of Ashbourne Manor holding their whispered truths with solemn witness. Each recognized the delicate bridge forming between them, trust, vulnerability, and the beginning stirrings of affection that neither dared fully name. A sudden clap of thunder startled them both, and Eleanor laughed softly, a sound of pure, unrestrained relief. The Duke inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. In that moment, the rigid barriers of formality seemed to falter, if only briefly. Yet the awareness of the world beyond these walls, the eyes of society, the expectations of family, loomed over them like a shadow, reminding them that every tender moment was precious precisely because it could not be public. Hours passed unnoticed, the storm eventually abating into a gentle patter against the glass. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself imagine a life in which these moments of quiet communion were not stolen, but ordinary. The thought was intoxicating, almost dangerous, yet she could not stop herself from daring to hope. The Duke, sensing the shift in her expression, placed a gloved hand lightly over hers. The gesture was not possessive, nor demanding, it was steady, deliberate, affirming that in this moment, their hearts were aligned in understanding, if not yet in ownership. "You must know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that my world is not easily softened. But with you, perhaps it might be." Eleanor's chest tightened with the weight of his confession, fragile and exquisite. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of true connection, a bond neither dictated by society nor confined to duty, but forged in quiet honesty and shared vulnerability. She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the dim light, and found herself speaking words she had not dared to form before. "Then I will learn you, as you have learned me. And perhaps, together, we might discover what we have both long denied." His eyes, dark and unreadable moments before, softened with recognition, and he inclined his head in silent agreement. The storm outside had passed entirely, leaving the night still and expectant. and Eleanor felt the first tremor of hope ripple through her chest. The journey was far from over. The Duke's heart, disciplined and guarded for decades, remained an intricate fortress, and she knew the path to tenderness would be gradual, careful, and fraught with hesitation. Yet in the quiet alcove, amidst the fading echoes of the tempest, a bridge had been built, a fragile, luminous bridge that promised the possibility of warmth, trust, and love. And as she withdrew her hand slowly, heart pounding, she realized that the man before her, once so distant and unyielding, had allowed her to glimpse a truth that could no longer be ignored. He was not merely a husband to fulfill duty, but a soul capable of connection, waiting, perhaps as nervously as she, for the day they might embrace it fully. The ballroom erupted in applause, sharp and glittering, as the Duke of Ashbourne's carriage drew to a halt outside the grand house. Eleanor felt the press of society's eyes upon her like a tangible weight, heavy as iron chains. Tonight, she would walk beside the man she had learned to fear, admire, and, in secret, hope for, a man whose icy reserve had, over weeks, begun to thaw beneath the subtle warmth of her presence. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and inhaled the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax that drifted from the hall. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, each a reminder that the night would demand both courage and restraint, elegance and endurance. He appeared at her side, as statuesque and commanding as ever, his dark eyes briefly meeting hers with a glimmer of unspoken understanding. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice a measured cadence that carried both authority and a hint of anticipation. Eleanor nodded, a small smile brushing her lips. In that single glance, she felt the fragile bridge they had begun to construct stretch a little further, strengthened by months of quiet observation, tender gestures, and the shared acknowledgement of what neither could yet name aloud. The assembly was a torrent of music, murmurs, and polished etiquette. Guests floated across the floor in flowing gowns and pressed uniforms, each movement choreographed with social precision. Eleanor's steps were measured, deliberate, her gloved hand rested lightly against the Duke's arm, aware of the scrutiny but comforted by the firm steadiness beneath her fingers. The Duke's gaze swept across the crowd, not with judgment, but with an imperceptible protection, a subtle shield that she alone seemed to notice. A blush rose to her cheeks. She realized, with a tremor of delight, that she was not invisible to him, nor did she wish to be. As the evening unfolded, Eleanor felt the delicate interplay of public expectation and private longing. Every polite conversation with distant relatives, every curt nod to a visiting dignitary, was observed and, where necessary, moderated by the Duke. Yet, amid the ritual of appearances, he found ways to communicate through the smallest gestures, a guiding hand at her elbow, a barely perceptible squeeze of her wrist, the briefest tilt of his head that invited her gaze toward him. Each act was understated, yet spoke volumes, affirming that, in this sea of observation and judgment, they were not alone. A minor scandal arose mid-evening, as one of the Duchess's acquaintances whispered rumors of impropriety regarding a cousin's recent indiscretions. Eleanor felt the familiar pang of embarrassment, the familiar tightening in her chest, and instinctively drew back, shrinking beneath the weight of expectation. But the Duke's hand closed lightly over hers, a protective anchor that steadied her more effectively than any words could have done. "They are inconsequential," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear. "Do not let their smallness diminish your dignity." Eleanor's pulse quickened, the impact of his attention, both private and deliberate, washing through her like a sudden, warm tide. Later, in the relative quiet of a shadowed gallery, the Duke paused, turning to face her fully. His eyes, dark and unreadable moments before, now softened with something dangerously tender. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice almost a whisper against the distant strains of music, "I have watched you navigate every challenge with a grace I did not expect. You have endured scrutiny, expectation, and yet, you remain unbroken." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, and a blush spread across her cheeks. The acknowledgement was more than praise, it was recognition of her spirit, of her resilience, and of the subtle power she wielded in touching his heart. I only do what I must," she replied, voice steady but betraying a flicker of vulnerability. "It is not courage, it is survival." The Duke inclined his head, but a rare, almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. "Then perhaps you are braver than you perceive. And perhaps, there is more to your heart than you admit to yourself." The words, gentle yet unrelenting, struck her with the force of revelation. For months, she had observed him, sought to decipher his restrained gestures and rare attentions. Now, for the first time, she realized that he had been observing her with equal scrutiny, equal care, and perhaps equal longing. A waltz began, and the Duke offered his hand. Eleanor hesitated, then placed her gloved hand within his. As they moved across the floor, the world contracted to the space between them, the steady rhythm of music, the press of his palm, the subtle heat of proximity. She felt a thrill she could neither name nor fully comprehend, an intoxicating mixture of fear and anticipation. Every measured step, every glance exchanged beneath the veneer of propriety, spoke of connection, of understanding, of the first tender stirrings of love made visible in the smallest, most deliberate acts. When the dance ended, he did not release her hand immediately. Instead, his fingers lingered lightly upon hers, and he spoke with quiet gravity. "Know that I value this, your presence, your attention, the way you navigate the world with dignity even when it seeks to diminish you. I admire you, Eleanor, more than decorum allows me to declare openly." Eleanor's heart thudded violently. She had imagined words like these in fleeting moments of daring hope, but to hear them spoken by the man whose approval she had long coveted was both intoxicating and terrifying. She bowed her head slightly, speechless, yet her pulse sang with the recognition of what had been silently growing between them. The night wore on, and the guests gradually departed, leaving the grand hall bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, shadows stretching across polished floors. The Duke guided Eleanor to the edge of the terrace, where the cool night air stirred the hem of her gown. He stood close, not imposing, yet impossibly present, a force both commanding and protective. "Tonight has been significant," he said softly. "I hope you perceive what I could not declare in words to the assembly." Eleanor's breath caught. She nodded, aware that the bridge between public restraint and private affection had lengthened, perhaps irrevocably, in this one evening. "Then I will hold that understanding with care," she murmured, the words a fragile promise, delicate as the night wind, yet unwavering in intent. He inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she glimpsed the faintest light in his eyes, a spark that could grow into warmth, affection, perhaps even love. As they withdrew into the manor, hand in hand, Eleanor felt the weight of the journey they had undertaken, the triumphs of subtle connection, the victories of small gestures, the audacity of mutual recognition. And yet, the shadow of the unknown remained, the years of isolation, the habits of restraint, the ever-watchful eyes of society. The bridge they had built was fragile, delicate, and dependent on care, trust, and courage. And as the door closed softly behind them, sealing the ballroom and its glittering scrutiny away, Eleanor realized with a thrill and a tremor alike that the Duke's heart was no longer entirely beyond reach, but whether it would open fully, or remain veiled in icy decorum, was a question that neither of them could yet answer. The morning sunlight struck the manor windows with such brilliance that Eleanor started, caught off guard by its sudden warmth. The storm of weeks past, storms of society, expectation, and internal struggle, had given way to a fragile serenity, yet she felt the same tremor in her chest as she dressed for the day. Today was not a ball, nor a formal gathering, but a private moment that would test everything they had slowly, painstakingly built. She adjusted the delicate lace at her wrist and exhaled, realizing she was more nervous than she had ever been in her life, though nothing of this fear could be confessed aloud. The Duke was already in the morning room, seated beside the broad hearth, his profile rigid but somehow softened in the gentle daylight. He looked up at her arrival, and for the first time, Eleanor did not see distance in his eyes, nor the measured reserve that had kept her at bay for months. She saw only recognition, and, more dangerously, warmth. The sight made her throat constrict. She had come to depend upon the quiet certainty of his presence, the steady rhythm of his observation, and now that she was before him in the solitude of morning, the reality of intimacy pressed against her chest like the weight of a tide. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, measured, but carrying a softness she had longed to hear. It was a greeting ordinary in words but extraordinary in meaning, for the tone conveyed not duty, nor expectation, but acknowledgment of shared experience. Eleanor curtsied slightly, a polite gesture that could never encompass the storm of feeling within her. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, but the formalities seemed unnecessary, almost absurd, in the presence of the quiet understanding that filled the room. He gestured toward the table, where breakfast was laid in modest elegance, tea, fresh-baked bread, and fruit, a simplicity at odds with the grandeur of the manor. "Sit," he said, and she obeyed, noting that he made no pretense of ceremony beyond what was necessary, as though the walls themselves demanded formality while their hearts permitted quiet honesty. Eleanor poured her tea, the delicate clink of porcelain punctuating the otherwise still air. They spoke little at first, exchanging measured observations about the estate, the morning light, the subtle changes in the gardens, and yet every word carried weight. Each phrase was laden with the knowledge of shared time, of battles endured and small victories of understanding achieved. Eleanor felt the bridge between them stretch further, strengthened by trust, care, and a tender acknowledgement of mutual desire that had grown too large to ignore. After a silence, the Duke leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I have watched you navigate my world with courage and grace. You have endured scrutiny, expectation, and my own, perhaps excessive, demands. I find that I am changed by your presence. The coldness I have maintained for decades is no longer sufficient to shield me." His words were deliberate, spoken as though each syllable had been weighed for months, and Eleanor felt her chest swell, tears threatening, not of sorrow, but of relief and recognition. She reached out, her gloved hand trembling slightly, and he did not pull away. The bridge was no longer fragile, it was alive. "Then, if you permit it," she said softly, "let us learn together what warmth we have denied ourselves. Let us begin to live in more than propriety." Her words were tentative, yet laden with courage, and he inclined his head, a faint but unmistakable smile curving the corners of his lips. "Together," he agreed. The first kiss was not a dramatic, sweeping declaration, nor a public spectacle. It was a careful, deliberate touch of lips, soft and measured, yet carrying the full weight of months of longing, restraint, and unspoken emotion. Eleanor's hand rose to rest lightly upon his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric, a rhythm that matched her own in a delicate, silent harmony. The act was small, intimate, and infinitely significant, a union of souls more than bodies, a confirmation that duty had given way to affection, and affection had begun to blossom into love. They spent the morning in quiet communion, walking through the gardens, the dew still clinging to petals and leaves, speaking in tones low enough that the world beyond Ashbourne could not intrude. Every glance, every fleeting brush of hand against hand, spoke of devotion, respect, and a fragile triumph over the constraints that had sought to keep them apart. Eleanor noticed the subtle relaxation in the Duke's posture, the way his eyes lingered on her with a mixture of admiration and wonder, as though he were discovering her in ways the outside world could never dictate. By midday, they paused beneath a tall oak, sunlight filtering through the leaves in shifting patterns across the grass. Eleanor turned toward him, and he took her hands in his, gloved fingers enclosing hers in a firm yet gentle clasp. "I have guarded my heart for many years," he murmured, "but with you, Eleanor, I see that restraint is no longer necessary. I would have you know, fully and without pretense, that my regard is yours, and my heart, if you will accept it, belongs to you." Eleanor's breath caught, and the tears she had held at bay since childhood prickled behind her lids. "I accept it," she whispered, voice trembling but certain. "I have longed for it, though I scarcely dared imagine it." The words were simple, yet monumental, and in their utterance, the vast halls of Ashbourne Manor seemed to soften, the shadows retreating, the sunlight brightening, as if the world itself recognized the union of two hearts long restrained. They remained in the garden until the sun had climbed high, their conversation meandering from small observations to hopes, to shared dreams of a life unburdened by expectation, a life marked by affection, respect, and partnership. Every laugh, every glance, every soft gesture of hand upon hand, reinforced the intimacy they had fought to nurture, the fragile trust that had endured storms both literal and metaphorical. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, Eleanor felt the weight of the future pressing lightly upon her shoulders. The Duke's heart had opened, yes, but years of solitude, duty, and pride could not be erased in a single morning. The world beyond Ashbourne still existed, and they would face it together, yet cautiously, with patience and care. The victory was not in the absence of challenge, but in the knowledge that, whatever trials awaited, they would confront them side by side. As they turned back toward the manor, Eleanor's gaze met his, and she felt the quiet certainty of their bond, the unspoken promise that love, patience, and devotion would guide them through every shadow. And yet, in that moment of perfect intimacy, a flicker of anticipation remained, delicate and unspoken. Would the world, with its relentless scrutiny and expectation, recognize the quiet, steadfast love that had blossomed behind these walls, or would it yet demand its toll upon hearts too newly brave to be unguarded?